Hello and welcome to the Frozen Biscuit. I'm your host, Zach James, along with my co-host, Noah Seuss. And today we have a special guest, your Boston Bruins radio announcer, Judd Sirott. And first of all, we'd like to thank you for coming on the show for us. It's a real honor.
Thanks for having me, Zach and Noah.
So first, so how did you first get into announcing?
It probably started back when I was around 13. So I played all sorts of different sports. I played baseball. I played football. I played tennis. I played all sorts of stuff. I loved playing all sorts of sports. And then when I was 12 or 13, my best friend from across the street, who was a huge hockey fan, introduced me to the Blackhawks. Now you have to remember when I was growing up, and this is, so at this time, this is like late 70s, early 80s. Mm-hmm. The Blackhawks were not on television, and they weren't on free television. So you couldn't see home games. And back then, the idea of paying for cable TV was so new. We didn't have it. My best friend across the street had, and he invited me over and he said, "Come on, let's watch the Blackhawks." And so I had an opportunity to watch the game with him. And I saw a guy named Dennis Savard, who's now a Hall of Famer. And I heard a guy named Pat Foley, who was only doing radio at the time. But my neighbor across the street said, "You got to listen to this guy. We'll listen to him. We'll turn down the sound on the TV and we'll sync it up and we'll listen to the radio." And when I heard him and I saw Savvy, I just got the bug. I loved hockey and I loved Pat. I loved Pat's style. He sounded like he was having so much fun. And I think from that point forward, that's when I knew what I wanted to be. But as I told you guys during the camp, how do you get from A to B? How do you get from 12, 13-year-old kid growing up just outside of Chicago to where I am now, the radio voice of the Boston Bruins? That takes some time.
What was your favorite sport growing up?
To play or to watch?
Let's start with watch.
Watch. I guess I liked all of them. I came to hockey late because when I grew up in Chicago, and as I mentioned, you couldn't really see the Blackhawks on TV, so nobody saw them. And hockey wasn't as big in Chicago as it is now. With the popularity of the Blackhawks when they went through their golden age, basically. And it was actually, I was so fortunate to be there right at the same time. So it started right around 2008. And it pushed all the way forward probably, to the 2015 season when they won their third Stanley Cup. The amount of popularity in the sport and the amount of rinks that went up started to really increase exponentially. Like for me, as a kid growing up 40 minutes outside northwest of the city, there were no rinks. So really the only opportunity to play was if they froze a parking lot or they froze the park and you played it at an outdoor rink. And there were a number of places that you had an opportunity to do that. So I didn't really play a lot of hockey as a kid, and I came to it very late until I was really introduced to it at age 12 or 13. So I loved baseball. That was probably the sport that I was best at. In high school, I was a 3-sport athlete. I played football, I played baseball, and I also played tennis. But I would say my favorite sport to play was probably baseball. I love to pitch, and I could hit a little bit. And that was, I loved the game. But I loved all sorts of different sports, and I would devour, just like you, on the weekend or even during the weekdays during the summer. I would devour every sport I possibly could.
Yeah, like you said, we're like during that golden age where like in LA, there were a bunch of rinks sprouting up during that 2012 and 2014 Stanley Cup runs. But, it's been a long time since that kid in Chicago became the Boston Bruins radio guy. So what was that journey like for you?
Well, it's a long journey. I'll try and see if I can shorten it a little bit. I knew what I wanted to do, but it was a process to try and get here. And as I told you guys, when I had a chance to talk in the camp, that it takes some time, and it's important. I think for young guys like you and for other kids who are working their way up into the business, to work on their craft and work on the things that they control. And you can go step by step by step and eventually, hopefully, make it to the place that you want to go, which is the National Hockey League. But for me, the first thing that I needed to do was, okay, well, I wanted to do these games. I needed experience. I needed repetition. So when I was choosing colleges, I wanted to choose a place that had a hockey program, that had a student radio station, and at the same time was also a good education. So I went to the University of Michigan, which was a great experience. I had a chance to do a ton of hockey games there. Graduated from U of M. I applied for a bunch of minor league jobs in the American Hockey League. There was another league called the IHL, the International Hockey League, that's not around anymore. Those two leagues merged. But I applied for jobs in both those leagues, didn't have any luck, and eventually came home. And I had done some interning in sports radio, and sports radio was just starting to form. There were really only 2 stations at the time when I was in college. On the East Coast, there was WFAN, and on the West Coast, there was Extra out of San Diego. But that was it. So the third sports station in the United States that started was The Score. And I knew some people in Chicago who were starting The Score. And I was asked, would you like to be an executive producer? And I said yes. So that was my foothold to kind of get into the business on a paying level. So I worked there for 3 years. And then I was fortunate enough, a team called the Chicago Wolves just started in the International Hockey League right in my backyard. And I got an opportunity because I had some experience doing games, and I also knew the Chicago media. They asked if I would come on and do the games and also be one of their media relations people and help run the department. So I landed there, and I was there for 12 great years. And I met so many people in hockey. I had a chance to see so many people who are now GMs and coaches and have gone on to upper management roles. And at the same time, I also had a chance to learn the game from so many great coaches and players, and learn how to deal with players and learn sort of the inner workings of how the game works. So I was there for 12 years. Then I landed a job with Mark Cuban, who was carrying the games nationally on his network at the time. It was called HDNet. So we did the best game that we could find on TV every Thursday and Saturday. And then from there, because Mark, excuse me, decided he didn't want to cover the games anymore. He wanted to throw his resources into mixed martial arts. It just so happened, and a lot of, I think what we can talk about down the road is that in order to get to where you want to go, you have to be good, but you also have to be lucky, and your timing has to be right. When I left HDNet, the Blackhawks were undergoing a huge change in ownership and management, and the rights changed for the radio there and who was covering the games. And it went from it went from The Score to a station called WGN, which is a great heritage station, but they didn't really know anything about hockey. And I knew a lot of the people over there, having worked in the market for a long time. And I sent them a note, and I said, "Hey, I understand that you've got the Blackhawks now. If I can help with anything, you let me know." And they called right back. They said, "We don't know a ton about the game. We could really use your experience." So I landed there, and I was with the Blackhawks and with GN for 10 years. And in the middle, because GN also had the Cubs, I also had an opportunity to do the Cubs at the same time. So I was doing Blackhawks and Cubs. And then when the Bruins job opened up in 2017, I was actually on a couch in California on vacation with my family. And I saw that a guy named Dave Gosher, who's now the television voice of the Vegas Golden Knights, was leaving Boston to take the job in Vegas. And my wife and I had always talked that, you know what, if an opportunity popped up, you know, we'd really like the opportunity to maybe expand and live and raise our kids in another town. And that would be part of the adventure and the growth experience for them and for our family. And so I had a chance to meet with station management. I also had to have some conversation with the Bruins. And I think what I told both at the time was, listen, I'm working in my hometown. They treat me really well. They treat my family really well. It's a dream to be able to have the job. But at the same time, a job like the Bruins, being the play-by-play voice of the team in a city like Boston, for a franchise like the Bruins, being an original six team, these opportunities just don't come up all that often. And I really want this job. And I was so fortunate and so humbled to get the opportunity to land here.
What is your message to inspiring broadcasters like us, like the many people who dream of doing what you do?
Well, I think first of all, it's to get repetitions, to learn your craft, and the only way to do it is to be able to do games. I also think it's really valuable to do as many different sports as you possibly can, because that makes you a much more well-rounded broadcaster. Do football, do basketball, do baseball, do hockey, do some sports that you wouldn't necessarily think of. Do soccer, do track, do golf, whatever the case may be. I think that will help you grow as a broadcaster. I think anytime also that you can put yourself in public speaking situations, that'll help. So you learn how to become a good speaker. I also think it's important, and I didn't really mention this as much when we spoke at the campus. I think it's important to be able to become a good writer as well, because you're going to have opportunities, or you're going to need that skill, whether it's doing games on radio, on television, helping to produce some stuff. There are going to be projects that people ask you to do. And I think that will help you as you round out your skills as a broadcaster. And then I think long-term, I think you have to understand that it's a process. It takes time. There are a lot of people who are going to say no, and you can't get offended by that. What you have to do is you can ask them, so if it's okay, I'm just curious why you didn't necessarily like me for the job and what you think I can do to become a better broadcaster. And they're going to give you feedback on your style. Maybe they don't like the way your goal call sounds. Maybe they don't like how you conduct conversation with your partner. Maybe they think you can work on inflection. Maybe they think your command of the language can be better. And by getting that feedback, and even though these people have said no, you can help improve your skills and everything that goes into broadcasting a game. And I think it also teaches you to be patient. These things take time. There are certainly a lot of stories, however, of a lot of guys who are young and get some big breaks, and they're super talented, and they get opportunities in the game. And that's great. But everybody goes about it in a different way. There is no one right way to do it. And I think you have to give yourself an opportunity to be patient with yourself, build your skills, continue to network and make contacts, have conversations with the people in these games, decision makers at radio stations, decision makers for teams. And then over time, based on the experience you have, how good you become at your craft, the people that you meet, opportunities will present themselves, and hopefully you're able to cash in.
I mean, you're at the top of your game. Being one of 32 NHL radio announcers. So was it like just to prepare for even just a regular game, and then again comparing to the Stanley Cup playoffs? And I know you've done Cup finals in 2019. So what's it like that there?
Well, I think preparation is important, and that's another thing that you can learn as a broadcaster by doing some of the repetitions that you and I have talked about. It's not just doing the game, but it's okay. How do I get ready for a game? What does it take? What do I need to be able to get ready? What works for me? What are some of the things that other broadcasters do to get themselves ready? It's different for everybody. And I think that the system that I have, I probably started it when I was doing college hockey games at the University of Michigan. But that whole process of doing games then, I think I'm still working on it all the way up until now. So it's how do you do it? So the basics for me, I think I spend about an hour reading. Now it's different because if I'm doing the National Hockey League, there's a lot of stuff out there to read and watch. If you're doing a college sport, if you're doing a minor league sport, if you're doing something that is totally on the amateur level, you might not have articles that are written about the players, that are written about the teams, to be able to get ready. So we can talk about how to prepare for that. But for a regular NHL game, I spent about an hour just reading, both on the Bruins and the team that they're playing, and also national stuff. It takes about an hour for me to digest the stats on both the Bruins, the team they're playing, and some of the other stuff that's going around the National Hockey League. I'll spend at least a half hour, maybe less, on the team that they're playing, being able to, I want to be able to watch the team, and I can put the numbers to names immediately, because that's fundamental. If I'm on radio and I tell you, 15 has the puck, that doesn't mean anything. Or if 37 has the puck, that doesn't mean anything. If I tell you Patrice Bergeron has the puck, that has meaning. So I'll spend about a half hour on that. And then when I have all that done, I'll probably spend at least another, depending on how much time I have and how often I've seen the team, I'll spend anywhere from the next an hour to 90 minutes making sure that I study that information, study the stats, compile the stories that I have. That's one thing I neglected to mention. I'll usually spend a little time putting together maybe some stories that I'd like to get to during the broadcast. So I'll spend about an hour to an hour and a half getting all that into my head, just so I'm ready for a game. So that's 82 times a year, times 3.5 hours. And that's really the minimum amount of time that I like to get ready. But I think it's important. In the same way, you're no different than a player. So a player is going through the same regimen to get himself ready for the game. He's stretching, he's working out, he's going through a morning skate, he's eating the right stuff, he's taking a nap, he's watching video, and then he's getting to the game, typically at the same time. We're the same way. So try and get into that routine, find a routine, get into that routine, and at the same time, you can also evaluate, what do I want to ditch from my routine? What do I want to add to my routine? So you constantly become better at your craft and getting ready for a game. But as far as the playoffs, and I think that's the other thing, I don't really try and prepare any differently for the playoffs. The playoffs is just usually, sometimes it's preparing a little bit more, because I've got regular season numbers and I've got playoff numbers and playoff histories that I have to look at. But you're also seeing the same team on a night in, night out basis. So I don't know if I have to go over the stats quite as much, but I may spend a little bit more time preparing the stories that I might want to tell during the course of the game. And then one quick sidebar when it comes to the stories. So I like stories. Stats are important for me, but I like to be able to engage by telling stories, talking about stories with my partner. They have to fit at the time. I mean, if the Bruins are getting shellacked 7-0, maybe a story that I'm looking at might not be the time for me to tell that story. So I try and time it out. I might not use it that night. I might not use it the next game. I might use it 3 weeks down the line. I might have to wait till the end of the regular season or the season beyond. I can always keep that. But I think you have to be able to tell stories at the right time. You have to make them fit. But for me, I think it's really important. I don't know if you listen to Doc Emmerich and all as kids, when he was doing games on various networks, but Doc and I used to talk about stats and stories, and he used to say that the sermon is not as listened to as the story that might be told in church. So that was just his little example of what gets listened to and what people may not engage with. So it's very much a preference. I think when it comes to stats, it has to be something that's easy for everybody to digest. It has to be something that's really on point. But I do think that they're important, but I really try and spend a lot of time putting together stories that I think Bruins fans, people listening to the broadcast might really enjoy during the course of the game. But it's important in the big picture. Get a system that works, do it all the time, do it the same way, arrive at the same time, try and make all of that a regular part of your routine. That's going to help make you get better.
Okay, now we're gonna move on to the Boston Bruins. What do you think they have to do to make their team better all around compared to last year? Like,
Well, last year they had a record-setting season. No team had a regular season quite like that, but they weren't able to follow that up in the playoffs. They lost in 7 games in the first round of the Florida Panthers, who ultimately went on to the Stanley Cup final. The Bruins had leads in that series of 3-1, and also led by a goal in Game 7 and couldn't shut it down. So I think for most teams around the National Hockey League, the regular season is important, but setting records, and it certainly wasn't the case for the Bruins, that's not their goal. The goal is what happens in the playoffs. But it's hard to make the playoffs. So you have to be dialed in across an 82-game season just to make the playoffs. The Florida Panthers, wildly talented, underperformed during the regular season and were this close to missing the playoffs. But they made it, and they made a run. I think for the Bruins, what they're going to have to do is some of the success that they've had, if we're going to look back at last season, the way they defended, their goaltending, that was the strength of the team last year. That was the backbone of the team. It should be again. The goaltending, the defense, it's for the most part intact. Once they get to the playoffs, that has to continue to be the backbone of the team. That's one of the things that's going to have to translate. I think if you look at the Bruins right now on paper, and again, it's only on paper. So Patrice Bergeron retires. We're still waiting to find out the news on David Krejci. Either way, the Bruins are missing a Hall of Fame player that served as their number 1 center for close to 19 years. That's going to be hard. That's going to be a hard void for one person to fill. So everybody's going to have to do just a little bit more in order to fill that void. If you happen to watch the Bruins last year in that first round series against the Florida Panthers, they didn't have Bergeron and Krejci for games 3 and 4. And they won those 2 games. And it helped them take a 3-1 lead. So the way they played in games 3 and 4, the desperation, the guys that they used, Charlie Coyle and Pavel Zacha, were their top 2 centermen playing in the playoffs while Krejci and Bergeron were out. Those are the guys in particular. They're going to have to shoulder a little bit more of the load. But I think as a group, the forwards, the defensemen, everybody's going to have to do a little bit more in order to put the Bruins in a position to make the playoffs. Center for a long time has been a big strength of the Bruins with guys like Krejci and Bergeron. We're talking close to 2 decades. Those guys played together. That's how fortunate the Bruins have been. And what's really made them one of the best teams around the National Hockey League since 2009. One of those guys is gone. There's a chance both of those guys could be gone. There's no one in particular that can fill that role right now. If the Bruins are going to be better, they're going to need more from everybody around, and they're certainly going to need more from the guys that are playing down the middle.
Speaking of Bergeron, I know how much he's meant to the city and, the Bruins organization as a whole, but what did he mean for you just calling him on a nightly basis?
Oh, he was a treat. He put on a clinic on the ice every single night. I don't think I've seen a player quite like that. He did the right thing every time, every night. It was rare to see a mistake with Patrice Bergeron. And then off the ice, he put on a clinic as a human being, what it was like to treat people, the respect he had, how he how he dealt with the media, how he dealt with his teammates, how he dealt with controversy that would come up, his ability to listen, his ability to be a human being, his ability to reach out to different people. The stories that you hear about Patrice Bergeron and what he's like as a person, I can tell you they are 10 times better once you meet him. He's an incredible person. But being able to watch him on a night in, night out basis, it was a treat because he was always on. He always made the right decision. He was always in the right position. I remember having a conversation with Mike Babcock, who's now back in the league as the head coach of the Columbus Blue Jackets. And Babcock had a chance to coach Bergeron in the Olympics. And one of the things that he always used to talk about was that Bergeron, he wasn't just a step ahead of everybody upstairs mentally. He could think the game 5 or 6 steps ahead of everybody. And that was his ability that I think there are very few guys that have ever played the game that had that type of skill, but he was able to use that computing power along with his skill, his hands and his feet and his strength and his ability, his agility to make him a Hall of Fame player.
What is it like to watch David Pastrnak grow every year?
He's a treat to watch because I think I told you guys at camp, there is never a bad day in David Pasternak's world. He's one of those guys that is so engaging, so charismatic, and it carries over on the ice with the flair that he plays with, the style, the speed, the moves, the shot. He's something else. And the campaign that he had last year was absolutely fabulous. And I think with a guy like David Pastrnak, you can really see the growth in his game, probably in the last, I'd say 6 or 7 years in particular. When he came on board, he wasn't always playing with Patrice Bergeron and Brad Marchand. That happened a little bit later in his career, probably started a little bit more frequently when Bruce Cassidy was there. But having him there, I think really taught him how important it was to be a responsible player. And the more that you check, the more often that you're going to have the puck. And I think that he started to understand that. The other thing that he also understood, and I was fortunate to be around Patrick Kane for a long time. I spent a decade with Patrick Kane. And one of the things that made Kane so dynamic as a player was that he was a multi-threat and he was so unpredictable. And Pastrnak, especially over the last 2 or 3 years, has really started to introduce that into his game, that he can not only be a goal scorer, but he'll be a playmaker. He'll pass. And when he does look to score, he'll do it in different ways. It doesn't always have to be the big back scratcher one-timer. It doesn't always have to be a snipe. Maybe it's a move. Maybe it's a slapper. Maybe he'll go to the front of the net for a garbage goal, but he'll try and do it in different ways. And I think because his shot selection is varied, because he'll also look to pass, it makes him much harder to defend. And he's a joy to watch every night.
I mean, there's been a number of moves that the Bruins have done this offseason, but what do you think? As a Kings fan, we love Milan Lucic. So what do you think it means coming back to Boston for the...
Oh, I think it's huge. And you could see how excited he was. I think he might have been out on the West Coast. He might have been in Los Angeles and he didn't have all of his gear with him, and he got the news and he signed. I think he ran out to a local sporting goods store just to buy a Bruins hat so he could have it on and he could post something on Instagram and Twitter and all the various social media platforms. So I think it's really important, and maybe even more so, that Patrice Bergeron has retired. So you have a link to the 2011 team, a guy who's won a Stanley Cup championship. In addition to that, it's a guy who understands the culture, a guy who was around with Zdeno Chara, Patrice Bergeron, David Krejci, Brad Marchand, so many other Bruins that helped formulate the culture that we see now. And it's kept the Bruins as one of the elite organizations in the National Hockey League. And at the same time, I also think that, listen, Lucic serves in an important role for the Bruins. I mean, he's a big, ferocious checker. If he gets there on time, he will strike the fear in the heart of opposing defensemen and anybody who's trying to get that puck out, basically in the opposing D zone. And he can still think the game. He's incredibly bright. So I think it's a good addition for the Bruins to be able to add him. And when you think of some of the other additions for the Bruins, and they added James Van Riemsdyk and Kevin Shattenkirk and Morgan Geekie, they didn't have a whole lot of money to spend. That's the way that the world works in the National Hockey League and the salary cap. So the salary cap here for the last number of years has been essentially flat. Well, player salaries don't always last at the same time. And for the Bruins last year, they pushed all their eggs and all their chips into the middle. I think I'm mixing metaphors here, but they pushed all their chips into the middle. So they have some bonus overages on the contracts to Patrice Bergeron and David Krejci for about $4.5 million that count toward the cap this year. Plus, you mentioned David Pastrnak, his big extension kicks in. So he goes from about $6.5 million to about, I don't know, just over 11 million. So based on some of those numbers, and Trent Frederick just signed today here for the Bruins, Jeremy Swayman, we should get an arbitration announcement on him. Those numbers are going to go up. They didn't have a whole lot of dollars to spend. So what they tried to do with Lucic, Van Riemsdyk, Geekie, Shattenkirk, some of the other guys they brought in, was try and fill some holes and maximize the dollars that they had in filling the needs that existed up and down the roster.
Do you think there's still a need for a first line center, or do you think they're going to stick with Zaka, stick with Coyle?
I don't know. I wouldn't necessarily say. I guess because so many of the teams and so many of the coaches and the players, they don't necessarily think first line, second line. Okay, what's your first line center? Is that the guy who scores the most points, or the guy who's on the ice at the most important times? So I think that can vary, but I think your point is well taken. Do I think the Bruins, what are they going to opt to go with? Who's going to be on the ice at the most important times? I think it's really going to vary. I think as an offensive player, Pavel Zacha probably has a higher upside than a guy like Charlie Coyle, but Charlie Coyle has also had 20-goal, 50-point seasons in the past. So what zone of the ice are the Bruins in? What's the matchup? What's the score of the game? What do you need at that point? The other thing that Charlie Coyle is really adept at is he can check, and he's a big body, as is Pavel Zacha. So I think that those guys may fluctuate. And I think you may think of them as almost 1A and 1B rather than first line, second line. I will say this about a guy like Pavel Zacha. So when Pavel Zacha was drafted, and I think he was in the 2015 draft, that was the same one that the Bruins grabbed Jake DeBrusk a little bit later. And he was chosen 5th overall by the New Jersey Devils. That when they took him, the forecast was that he would eventually be a top 6 centerman. So I think what you saw from him last year, and he played a lot on the wing, but he also played a lot in the middle when the Bruins were experiencing injuries, is that he was always expected to grow into a top 2 centerman. And I think the Bruins got a glimpse of that last year. He had a career high in offensive numbers. And I think that they are hoping that he continues to grow. He's still very young.
Speaking about DeBrusk, I know he here is a big Islanders fan, and he wants Jake DeBrusk very badly. So do you have any news on that?
Well, I don't think there's any news. So Jake is entering his final year as an I have to look and see his contract status. If you just kind of hang with me to take a look at Jake, and trust me, there are 31 other teams that are looking for a guy like Jake DeBrusk to be able to add. And Jake last year, I thought it was his best season as a National Hockey Leaguer. He was absolutely fantastic. So Jake, if I look at the numbers right here, he is coming out of, I think it's a 2-year, $8 million contract. He'll be an unrestricted free agent at season's end. There are going to be a lot of teams that obviously would be interested in a guy like Jake DeBrusk if he gets to unrestricted free agency. But I think what we saw from Jake, and some of that had to do with the coaching change, because I don't think it's any secret that he and Bruce Cassidy, at times, it was not a great mix. But it wasn't necessarily what Bruce Cassidy was telling him. I think it was the way the message was conveyed. And that was one of the things that changed with a guy like Jim Montgomery. And you started to see that from Jake DeBrusk last year, that even if you're not scoring, and he scored last year, he had a really good season offensively, and he played in a number of different roles. What are you doing if you're not scoring? How do you influence the game? And one of Jake's greatest attributes is his speed. He can fly. And last year, I think you saw that, and you saw that on a much more regular basis. And it's also natural. I think when it comes to players, and no, I think since you're a big Islanders fan, a guy like Matt Barzal, last year he had some difficult points of the season, and he certainly had he had some difficult times under Barry Trotz. So the growth is not like this one straight line. If you were looking at it on a graph that goes straight up, there are some dips, some troughs, some peaks. Maybe it's a straight line, then it's going up. So I think Jake has experienced some of that too, but he is starting to mature. And as he becomes a much more mature player, I think what you're hoping for is that there are fewer drops and it continues to rise. And what we saw was a consistent Jake DeBrusk last year, who was able on a night in, night out basis to really use his skills to be able to influence the game and score. I think that was really important. So listen, he has a good relationship with Bruins management. The salary cap is supposed to go up following next season. There will be more open dollars for the Bruins that they could pay a guy like Jake DeBrusk. But it'll essentially be up to him because he's an unrestricted free agent. It's his right that at the end of the season, if he wants to test the market, he can. So if I had to guess which way he was going to go, I don't know if he's going to be an Islander. I think he just might stay in Boston.
All of Long Island was just very upset by your answer.
Yeah.
So
I'm sorry to hear that. Listen, the Islanders are a good team. I'm sure we were going to talk about them at some point. One of the things that they really do well is they can defend. They got a great goalie. They got a great system. They got a great foundation in place, much like the Kings did, just as Daryl Sutter got there back in the early 2010s. But the one issue that the Islanders have is they have a hard time scoring and being able to tease out the offense. So that was part of their undoing last year. And I can understand why a guy like Jake DeBrusk would be of interest. But you have to ask yourself, if you're going to bring in Jake DeBrusk and he's going to command some big money, how are you going to pay for it if you're the Islanders and you have a lot of guys locked up to long-term deals?
So the Atlantic just got harder this year with the Brinket coming in to Detroit. Where do you think the Bruins will land? Like, what spot will they be in this year?
I don't think that there's any reason why the Bruins shouldn't be able to compete for a playoff spot, but it's going to be hard. Now, Alex was with a really talented team in Ottawa, and I think a lot of people thought that last year Ottawa and Buffalo would contend for playoff spots. It didn't really happen for Ottawa. Buffalo made it sort of interesting there at the end, but I think both of those teams are going to be even better this year because they're a little bit older and they're a little bit smarter. And I think for Ottawa, the other thing that was part of their undoing was they had some injuries. They had some instability in goal. And I think for a team like Buffalo, and they certainly made some adds and they're going to be better this year. Goaltending was an issue for them. They could score like crazy. The only problem was they allowed a ton of goals like crazy. So it's going to be tough. If you look at the Atlantic Division, Toronto made some changes and they brought in Tyler Bertuzzi. They added Max Domi. And the other thing that they have to think about is they have to get Austin Matthews signed. Maybe he could go to the Islanders. The Tampa Bay Lightning still have a terrific core, but because of some of the salary issues that they've had over the years. They continue losing some key players. They're a really good team, however. They're always going to be in the mix. I think the Florida Panthers are going to be right there. They were expected to be one of the powers last year in the Eastern Conference. They just didn't play well during the regular season, but they're going to be better this year. I think it's going to be a challenge for the Bruins. There were a lot of people, if you look back at last season, and we were having this conversation about the Bruins, a lot of people counted them out. A lot of people thought, nope, this is it. Bergeron and Krejci are over the hill. Charlie McAvoy, Brad Marchand, Matt Grzelcyk, all injured to start the season, may not be back for a couple of months. Bruins are done. They had the best regular season in National Hockey League history. So sometimes you have to keep that stuff in mind as we have these conversations in August about what's going to happen once the season begins. But I also think, listen, Detroit, I think is continually getting better and getting a little deeper. I don't think Montreal is ready to make the playoffs, but they're going to be a much tougher opponent. So those are all opponents and games that the Bruins are going to have to contend with during next year's regular season. But the way the schedule is, and I don't love the way the schedule is. If you're going to make people play out of your division, I think you should have more division games. So typically you play 4 against the Atlantic and 3 against the Metro. I think it should be 5 and 2 is the way I think a lot of people would like it. But you've got some other teams in the Metro that should definitely be better. Columbus is going to be better. I think the Devils are going to be better. I'll be interested to see what the Rangers look like. They didn't really make any additions necessarily, but they have a really good crew. Carolina is going to be really, really good again. Part of their issue was that they had injuries. Philadelphia is the only team in particular. They are admittedly going through a rebuild at this point. Washington has made a coaching change, and they've tried to reinvigorate their group on the fly. I guess in the big picture, what I'm trying to say is just to get into the playoffs in the Eastern Conference is going to be hard, and it's going to be a feat for the Bruins. Most teams are going to need anywhere from 95 to 100 points. So that's what you're looking at for any team in the East to get into the playoffs.
Yeah, I mean, you just got Seuss's hopes up very high, because if he thinks Austin Matthews is gonna go to the Islanders, he will yell it and scream that for about a year. But
all right, well, hold on, Noah. We got to look at the Islanders. Okay, we'll spend a minute here on the Islanders. Let's take a look at the Islanders and see where they're at on the salary cap. Do you know offhand?
We're a little bit over, I think, right now.
You are over the cap right now. So they've allotted about $84 million, and they're about $500,000 over the cap. So let's just take a quick glance at the Islanders. Barzal signed a big money long-term. Horvat signed a big money long-term. Anders Lee's under contract. Brock Nelson, J.G. Pajot, Kyle Palmieri, Pierre Engvall just got signed to a big contract. Casey Zizekas is signed long-term, and then shift to the D. Pollock, Pellick, Dobson, Mayfield, Elias Sorokin's big contract kicks in next year. I think the question you have to ask yourself is, how are you going to create the salary cap space to fit an impact player like that on your team? That's the problem. And I know Lou, and I love Lou to death. Love him. He wants to make a hockey trade to make his team better, but making hockey trades and just making trades because of the dollars that are involved, it's hard. And if you want to sign a guy like Austin Matthews, who's going to command at least $12 million a season, you have to ask yourself, for a team that right now is capped out, and they have most guys that are signed not only this year, but next year and beyond, how do they create that space to fit a player like that on their team?
I have some people in mind that we can get rid of.
yeah, he's gonna start doing mock trades as soon as we finish this interview. But so I guess on the Bruins as an organization, what is it like just, being part of a historic organization like that?
Oh, it's a treat. Are you kidding? There's only 6 of these franchises around, the original 6. So the Bruins are going to celebrate their centennial season this year. They are the oldest American franchise in the American Hockey League. I'm really, I am so excited to see what the Bruins have in store to celebrate their centennial season. Right now, there's a handful of us who've been asked to put together the top 100 legendary Bruins. So I'm going through that list right now. And then just before the season starts, it's going to be the top 20 all-time Bruins. And there's going to be a huge opening ceremony and a gala festival that's taking place. But it's just these guys, there are so many legendary players that have played for the Bruins, and so many guys that you get a chance to see on a fairly regular basis, whether that's the president of the team, Cam Neely, or a guy like Johnny Busick, who's been a part of the organization going back. You have to go all the way back to the 60s for a guy like Chief, who's been around all that time. And the Bruins have an incredibly rich alumni that a lot of those guys live here in the area. To see a guy like Rick Nifty Middleton or Terry O'Reilly or Mike Milbury, and to get a chance to shoot the breeze, interact with these guys, tell some stories. I can't tell you what a privilege it is to be a part of a team like this. And I think, as I told you guys in the camp, there are 31 other teams that are special around the National Hockey League, but there's only 6 of the original teams that were in the league: Boston, Chicago, New York, Montreal, Detroit, Toronto. That's it. These are the oldest franchises in the league. And they have a rich history that goes along with each of these franchises' names. And to be able to be immersed in that every day is just, I can't tell you how incredibly fortunate I am to be able to do their games.
Do we get a sneak peek of the list or no?
The sneak peek of the list? No, I haven't even submitted it. I just went through and I got, I went through, I got the 100, I ordered it. I kind of want to let the list sit for a couple of days, and then I'm going to come back to it and finalize it and then submit it. So we've got to submit it, I think, early next week. And then everybody else will submit theirs, and they'll start to look at the list. Well, you tell me, who are the top 3? Who are numbers 1, 2, and 3 for you? Okay. If you're putting together that list, top 3 legendary Bruins.
Okay, so Bobby Orr has to be on there. Yes. I'll go.
Bobby Orr has to be on there. He should be at the top of the list. Yes. Maybe the greatest player of all time.
I would probably, and my other 2, I think we put Ray Bourque and Phil Esposito for my 3.
There you go.
Yeah.
That's those would be guys that, I won't give away all of them, but those would be guys that would be heavily favored to be in the top 3. But there are so many to try and even pick out, all right, top 10. Well, you got a lot of names to be able to sort through, whether that's Johnny Busick or Dick Clapper. I mean, we're going way back, like legendary names like Eddie Shore, Bergeron, Chara, Cheesy Jerry Cheevers. If you guys have, I know you guys are much younger than I am, but if you ever see the old school goalie mask with all the scars painted on there, that's Cheesy. That's Jerry Cheevers. Milt Schmidt. If you go back and look at what his career was like for the Bruins and what he meant for the Bruins. So there are a whole host of guys that you have to choose from to be able to try and figure out, okay, where do all these guys fit on the list? It takes a little bit of time, but it's been fun to go through and work through this project.
What do you think the Leafs are going to do with their cap space? Because they are so many dollars over. It's insane.
Oh, let's play a little GM. Okay. let's take a look at the Toronto Maple Leafs. So they do have the option of another buyout window if they want, if memory serves, because they went to arbitration with Ilya Samsonov. So they have, if you look at the Leafs salary cap, the way it is structured right now, Austin at the end of the year, Austin Matthews, William Nylander, Tyler Bertuzzi, Max Domi, Sam Lafferty, Dylan Gambrell, TJ Brody, John Klingberg, and Mark Giordano, along with Samsonov, will be unrestricted free agents. They have 2 guys on long-term injured reserve, and they need that money. If they're going to go over the cap, they need that money. So right now they have Jake Muzzin and Matt Murray on long-term IR. That's just over $10 million. Now, the other thing that the Leafs are going to have to do is on day one, or just before the season begins, every team in the National Hockey League has to be salary cap compliant. Every team. So they can keep those guys on LTIR, which is just fine, but they still have some more money to be able to figure out, okay, what do they do to try and become cap compliant? So right now, the Leafs projected hit is $95 million. So they have to figure out how they're going to do it. Now, during the offseason, you can go a little bit over the salary cap, but you have to be in line, as I mentioned. You have to be cap compliant just as the season begins. Then you can start to monkey around with it. So they've got a job to do. Do they trade William Nylander? They're not trading Austin Matthews, I can tell you that. Do you buy out a guy like TJ Brody? I don't know if that's going to be doable for the team because they're already thin on defense. So they're going to have some big challenges ahead of them. And remember, it's a new general manager there, so it's a different show. Brad Treliving takes over with Kyle Dubas now in Pittsburgh. So he's got some gymnastics to do, but he's not the only general manager. If you take a look, there are a number of other teams that have to figure some of these things out. And there are some other contracts that also have to be figured out. So let's stay in the Eastern Conference. I'll give you another example. So the Rangers, and I know, Noah, you're a huge Rangers fan, right? You told me that, right? Didn't you tell me that?
The Islanders.
I'm just having fun with you. But you've got a contract that still has to be worked out with Alexis Lafreniere. What are the Rangers going to pay him? They don't have a ton of cap space right now, so they have to figure out what they're going to do. They already paid Keandre Miller, really good young defenseman, but that's the problem, that the way the salary cap is and the way these players are, I think just to go back to Mike Babcock, because he used to mention this when we would talk, is your team gets good, guys get paid, and then guys have to go because you can't afford them anymore and you have to make hard choices. That's why they couldn't retain Vladimir Tarasenko, and it still remains to be seen what happens with Patrick Kane. Kane's going through a major hip surgery, and I don't think he'll be ready until he's probably on the same track that a guy like Brad Marchand was at a year ago. So you're looking at the earliest November, but he hasn't signed anywhere. And does he sign with the Rangers? Does he go back to his hometown, the Buffalo Sabres? There's still a handful of other contracts that have to be sorted out, and all these teams have to put this stuff together so they're ready to go once October hits.
So we don't want to keep you waiting. So last question from me. I know you love to tell stories, but like, who in your eyes are like some of the greatest storytellers for broadcasting?
Well, when it comes to hockey, Doc Emmerich. I think Doc was I used to tell him this all the time. He was a hockey treasure. And in the same way, I think I told you guys about Vin Scully. Did you listen to Vin, or are you guys you're too young for Vin? Okay. Well, Vin was such a good storyteller, and he had so many, and he was around the game for so long. He worked baseball solo, and nobody could tell stories like this guy. But I used to tell Doc that what Vin was to baseball, Doc was to hockey. Just an incredible storyteller. How many players that he could tell stories about, how many situations, how many teams, how many eras. I would just sit down, pull up a chair, and listen to all the stories that Doc had. And we would trade some stories back and forth. Sometimes I would tell him something that he didn't know, and he told me one that I didn't know. Like, I'll give you an example. There was a guy named Jay Pandolfo who played for a long time, won Stanley Cups for the Devils, and later played for the Bruins and became an assistant coach for the Bruins. And he's now the head coach of Boston University, which is his alma mater. But Pando, when he was playing for the Devils, he was on their checking line. Lou Lamoriello loved him. It was Jay Pandolfo, John Madden, and Sergei Brylin. And they played together for years. And one of the things that always used to amaze Doc was, and he pointed this out to me, and I think he had the conversation with Jay about this, was, so he had to check the opponent's top line every single night. And he would finish the season with 2 penalty minutes, 6 penalty minutes, 4 penalty minutes. He would be able to do it completely scot-free. And so Doc told me that story. So I asked Pando about it when he was here. How did you do it? How were you able to pull that off? And so we were able to trade some stories, but Doc's ability to dig in and tell stories about players, coaches, managers, games. There were just so many of them, and they could be poignant, they could be funny, they could be interesting. They could deal with something that applied today, something that had to do with a championship. I always used to love that about Doc. And the other thing about Doc that I always liked, he didn't always have to talk to the star player. It didn't matter to Doc. He could walk into the room, and was it important for him to talk to Brad Marchand or Patrice Bergeron, Zdeno Chara? Sure, but Doc would not have any problem sitting down for a half hour and talking with Trent Frederick and sitting down with a bottom 6 forward, a guy who's certainly not on the stature of some of the Bruins that I had just mentioned, but he would get a great story about Trent Frederick. And I think that was always important, that it doesn't matter what player it comes from, that if the story is good, it doesn't matter. So since we'll stay with a guy like Trent Frederick, so I've told this story a couple of times. So his family owns a roofing company in St. Louis. And I told Freddie, I'm like, you got to get me a shirt. So the motto of the roofing company is, whether you've got a hole in your roof or you need a whole new roof, call Frederick Roofing. Exactly. So Noah, you smiled. And just to be able to tell that story when we're in St. Louis, or when we're in Boston, I think it's always a good story, and, listen, if all of a sudden Freddie goes top shelf, if he roofs the puck, then maybe I can go back to the roofing company story. But I love a good story. I love being able to get the reaction that I just got from you, a laugh or a wow, I didn't know that. Something completely different. So that's always entertaining. And there are a lot of guys that I can go to in the Bruins dressing room in particular to get stories. Listen, Marchand's great. David Pastrnak, awesome. Patrice Bergeron. I asked Bergie one time, and this was sort of basically like something I would get from Doc Emmerich. I used to ask Bergie, so the way that you see the play on the ice, and you're like 3 steps ahead of everybody, do you drive like that? Like, can you see an accident before it's going to happen? And so we had like a long conversation about that. And I think I used that during the course of the game. So I always like to do that. And I think it's something, if the story is really relatable, then I think that's able to transcend the broadcast. So I always try and look for that. And Doc, for me, and there are a lot of really good storytellers around the league, but Doc for me was the pinnacle.
That was a great question to end on.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much for coming on. It has truly been a pleasure to just talk with you for a while. And to the viewers watching, thank you so much for watching. Feel free to like, comment, subscribe. We will see you next time. And peace out, baby.
Thanks for having me on.
Bye.